centennial programs with biographer Michael Reynolds. This book, Hemingway, The Final Years, was published this month. It's Mr. Reynolds' fifth and final book in a series looking at the life of American writer Ernest Hemingway. Mr. Reynolds talked about Mr. Hemingway and his book recently in Oak Park, Illinois, where Mr. Hemingway spent part of his childhood. The event takes place in the high school Hemingway attended as a boy.
This brings us to the official business of our first session this morning, and it is a great pleasure to introduce Mike Reynolds. Had a chance to work as closely with Mike as I've ever worked on the panel yesterday that I referred to, and watched him handle the kinds of silliness and the kinds of well-intended, I think, often, but misleading comments we hear about Hemingway in a manner that was truly noble and intelligent, reflecting the 25, 27 years he's put into Hemingway scholarship in doing 5 volumes of Hemingway biography, several other books on Hemingway, A Threat to Do More, revision on Hemingway in the future. Mike is Professor Emeritus from North Carolina State. He's the newly elected president of the Hemingway Society. He's agreed to squeeze us into a several-week series of engagements dealing with the centennial. He's done the website New York Times introduction to Hemingway. I encourage you to read. Very nice overview. And has been a longtime friend of the foundation. He was our invited speaker in the early 90s for the birthday. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mike Reynolds.
Good place to be at this time of year, this time of the century. I see a lot of old friends out there. I'm particularly honored. I see H.R. Stonebuck back there, who's never gotten up for anything this early at a conference. It is my pleasure to speak, to lecture the choir, as it were, on Hemingway as an American icon. This is not my first trip to Oak Park, as you might imagine. I've been coming here since the 70s, off and on, but this is kind of a culmination. American iconography is an amazing collection of disparate events and people from our collective past. Washington crossing the Delaware, MacArthur coming ashore in the Philippines, names, faces that we admire, respect, detest, fear, most importantly, names and faces we recognize. Ben Franklin, self-made man, Babe Ruth watching the ball go over the fence, Joe McCarthy, demagogue, Marines raising the flag at Iwo Jima. They're images that are remembered and tell us something about our own collective psychic needs because we remember them. To achieve widespread recognition in one's own time, of course, is crucial to becoming an American icon. But the status does not come automatically. Just because you're important while you're alive isn't enough. To reach that higher level of recognition, one must endure in the nation's consciousness. Abe Lincoln became such an icon. Honest Abe, the uncommon, common man. We put his face on the copper penny where the poorest of the poor can see it every day. We put his general, Ulysses S. Grant, on the $50 bill. I doubt if you put Ulysses S. Grant's picture on the front of Life magazine today that anybody would recognize him, although $50 bills are becoming more prevalent, aren't they? Some, like Charles Lindbergh, achieve status through one daring act, one perfectly performed moment. Others achieve it through notoriety. Al Capone. We remember and recognize statesmen, military men, athletes, entertainers, but few and far between are the American writers whose faces remain in the public domain long after their deaths. If Henry James were to walk in today, More of you would probably recognize him than the general audience, but I'll tell you, it would be picking him out of a lineup might be tough. From our literary pantheon, only a few have reached the status of icon. Whitman, Poe, Twain, and Hemingway come to mind, each of whom crystallized something new in American letters. Whitman is the fountainhead of American poetry, like it or not. Poe of American horror, Twain of American humor, and Hemingway, I would say, is the fountainhead of the modern voice. Of these four, only Hemingway's face carries multiple and often contradictory connotations, as I'm sure most of you are aware. Born 100 years ago, Hemingway imprinted himself deeply into the literature, culture, and social psyche of an America that was changing from an upstart nation into a world power. That generation of the 1890s, Fitzgerald, Faulkner, Dos Passos, and Hemingway, changed forever how Americans wrote about themselves and how others saw us. These writers and their contemporaries became the modernists of the 20s, and among them, none was more prominent than Ernest Hemingway. 70 years after the last roar of the 1920s, Hemingway's face still requires no identifying caption. He's as well recognized in Shanghai as he is in Grand Forks. In his frenetic public life and private life, Hemingway had the uncanny ability to be on the edge of whatever important was about to happen. After being blown up in 1918 in Italy, he took us in his fiction and his journalism to the four wars that followed. For a nation of increasingly city-bound spectators, Hemingway's life became a media event. He took us into Africa with dangerous game out on the Gulf Stream for marlin. He was a living example of America's promise, the young boy from Oak Park who set out to be the best writer of his time. With pluck and luck, talent and wit, hard work and hard living, he did just that. In the process, he told us that pursuit was happiness, that duty mattered, and that any story followed far enough would end badly. Before he burned out, he remodeled the American short story, changed the way characters talked, confronted the moral strictures confining the American writer, and left behind a shelf of books telling us how we were in the first half of this century. His friend Scott Fitzgerald once said how difficult it was to believe in the youth of one's parents. You might say the same of the youth of Ernest Hemingway, who grew so media tall that it's hard to think of him here in Oak Park as a high school freshman finishing last in the cross-country run. Finished last the next year in the cross-country run as too, as a matter of fact. But he finished. That's important. It's hard to think of him as a young man in Paris, magnetic, brash, bawdy, a writer on the edge of immortality. Later, speaking of himself, he said, "It's always a mistake to know an author well." There were those who agreed with him, remembering him in all his flaws. Others, no matter how badly he hurt them, never ceased to defend him. This literary pushing and shoving, which began early, didn't thrive until he was dead and famous among his survivors. For some, he was the most important event in their lives. Poor Harold Loeb, for example, who tried all of his life to stop being Cohen in The Sun Also Rises, and on his obituary page in the New York Times, there it was once again. For some, he was the most important event. For others, he was only a summer storm crossing the bay. But no matter how he touched them, not the least of his commentators ever forgot the look and feel of him. Never forgot the way, as Archibald MacLeish said, that he sucked the oxygen out of the room simply by walking in the door. Women, those who loved him and those who did not, remembered him in great detail. One woman said, "I wouldn't have been surprised at anything Ernest did. He was unexpected and temperamental, a lovable person who took a great deal of understanding. He was sensitive, although he didn't seem to be. If you didn't know him well, you'd think he was rather tough." His first wife remembered him as one of the most sensitive people I ever heard of and easily hurt. She also said, quote, "He had the nerve of a brass monkey." I don't think it was nerve she was talking about exactly, but she said he was the kind of man whom men, women, and dogs were attracted to. He was scornful of some people and would say outrageous things about them. He had a cruel streak, yet his kindness went just about as far in the other direction. Kitty Cannell, who became part of The Sun Also Rises, thought he was phony, pretentious, untrustworthy, but she never forgot his apple cheeks, his infectious grin, nor his boyish enthusiasms. Men who were drawn to him had difficulty performing at his level of intensity, for Hemingway did nothing half-heartedly. Many enjoyed the bullfights. Few of them followed them all summer as he did. I enjoy fishing. I wouldn't mind doing a little deep-sea fishing 2 or 3 days. I don't think I could go out 60 days in a row. Ernest did. Whether it was skiing, fishing, drinking, he was competitive. Mike Strader said he always had to win. Gerald Murphy found the writer Hemingway huge and forceful. He overstated everything, talked so rapidly and so graphically and so well that you found yourself agreeing with him. All of these men were older than Hemingway. He was the youngest one in the bunch. Whether it was at the corrida in Pamplona, the ski slopes in Schruns, or an evening at a Paris dance hall, the Hemingway experience always demanded unexpected emotional resources. Few of his male friendships in those days lasted longer than 5 years. Reading their letters, you can watch them burn up and out like incandescent lamps. To whatever he touched, he added scale and a sense of importance. Murphy said, "The lives of some of us will seem, I suppose, by comparison, piddling. For me, he has the violence and excess of genius." He may not have outlived his friends and enemies who got in their last words, but he burned so much more brightly than most that we still read their statements by his light. We know so well the icon he became, it's difficult to imagine him unfledged, vibrant, with energy, laughing, joking along the boulevards of Paris, wearing sneakers, old trousers, a patched jacket, his long hair sticking out from underneath his cap, 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, mustached, and handsome, setting his own style. Friend said you'd see him walking down the Montparnasse. People would wave at him from the cafe. He didn't quite recognize him. Then he would see them, and his grin would be infectious, and he would smile, and soon everyone was smiling back. Moving with a curious, slow-footed gait, he was a man on his way somewhere else, always. Today, his name and face, as you well know, appear in strange and diverse places. More than a few problem drinkers salute Ernest as a kind of patron saint without ever having read his fiction. At mahogany bars in Key West, Bimini, Havana, Madrid, Paris, and countless other places, you can still find a face here and there who claimed to have shared a drink with Hemingway the night that he told them such and such. And if I had had a drink with everybody who's told me he's had a drink with Hemingway, I probably wouldn't be here today. At the Floridita, there is the infamous or famous Papadoble daiquiri. At the Ritz Hotel, there's a Hemingway bar, which wouldn't let me in because I didn't have a tie on. Wouldn't let Paul Smith in either. Hardly a metropolitan area is without its movable feast restaurant. Paramilitarists, you'll be happy to know, of various stripes use Hemingway quotes as personal sign-offs on their email. Big game hunters, marlin fishermen, boxing enthusiasts, and hardcore journalists think of Hemingway as one of us. Democrats and staunch Republicans find elements in Hemingway that support their point of view. In 1992, I was in Moscow, where they knew our man from Oak Park as well as I did. The previous year, a 600,000 volume edition of For Whom the Bell Tolls had been reprinted in paperback, and it sold out in 1 year in Russia. the old USSR. There's been a Hemingway conference in the heart of China, and there's a Hemingway Society in Japan, which is thriving. He's been translated into, my last count was about 20 or 22 different languages. What other American author has 6 houses preserved in 4 different states and 1 foreign country, has a street named for him in Pamplona, a line of sporting goods in New York, a look-alike contest in Key West, a fishing contest in Havana, an annual PEN Literary Award, a bad writing contest in Venice, and now a line of furniture? Can you imagine a William Faulkner look-alike contest? If you ask, there's people who'll tell you he's been dead for 38 years. But when we look around, there's Ernest seemingly alive and well on the face of a stamp or in a Mercedes ad or publishing another new novel. Unfortunately, the image that we have most deeply embedded in some ways is the old Hemingway, that Karsh portrait. And the Key West look-alike contest honors the old man, not the Hemingway of the 1930s when he lived in that peaceful outpost. I suggested to him that they should have a 1930s Hemingway look-alike contest. They weren't interested in that. He didn't begin as the old Hemingway any more than I began as the 62-year-old becoming decrepit Reynolds. Nor was his rise to fame instantaneous. In 21, when he arrived in Paris, he was unpublished, unknown, bearing introductions from Sherwood Anderson to people like Ezra Pound, Sylvia Beach, Gertrude Stein. Through Sylvia, he met James Joyce. Through Pound, he met Ford Madox Ford. He worked on the Transatlantic Review. I'll tell you, for a wannabe writer with those kind of introductions, if he hadn't turned out to be Ernest Hemingway, we would have been disappointed. He connected with every expatriate American writer in Paris. Through Gertrude Stein's salon, he fell in love with Cézanne's paintings and met young artists on the rise, Henri Gris, Henri Miro, Picasso. He met Joyce at Sylvia Beach's Lending Library. By 1924, there were rumors on the street that the handsome young man from Oak Park was thought by insiders to be a writer of some promise. Little and obscure magazines were beginning to publish some of his poetry, which I won't quote for you this morning because we're being taped for C-SPAN, that was being read by the Smart Set in East Village. Before ever meeting Hemingway, Scott Fitzgerald wrote Max Perkins at Scribner's telling him about a young man named Ernest Hemingway, misspelled, of course, because Fitzgerald misspelled Hemingway's name almost to the very end. A young man named Ernest Hemingway who lives in Paris and has a brilliant future. Over the next 2 years, Hemingway proved that true with 2 books, In Our Time, classic, now a classic collection of short stories. It was stories that were being taught in the classroom by the time Hemingway was 32. And of course, his roman à clef of the Fermin, San Fermin Feria, The Sun Also Rises. Leaving his mentors, Anderson, Stein, Pound, behind, and with his college equivalent education completed, Hemingway was quitting Paris just as the first impression of him as expatriate was forming. He said, I was never an expatriate. I was living in Paris because it was cheap to live in Paris. That's what most of us were doing. Lost generation, we were never lost. Beat up maybe, but never lost. Hemingway in the 30s asked Scribner's to stop putting out biographical information about him. He wanted his private life to remain private, but it was already too late. When he divorced his first wife, the story appeared in the New York Times. Photographs, caricatures, line drawings, woodcuts were appearing in national magazines. Young, handsome, virile, talented, he was a contradiction. The active man who excelled at the contemplative life. Book reviewers spoke of his writing in phrases uncommon in the previous age. In fact, I'm going to quote to you from the New York Times review of In Our Time, and it sounds like they're describing an athlete. Hemingway has a lean, pleasing, tough resilience. His language is fibrous and athletic, colloquial and fresh, hard and clean. In lean, spare sentences, he always makes you see the thing he writes about. Sounds like they're talking about Michael Jordan, doesn't it? I mean, they didn't have a way of even describing the way he was writing. 1930, bestseller, Farewell to Arms Out, was making his name more commonplace. He moved to Key West, Florida, just as the Great Depression was rearranging the face of America. A more remote location would have been difficult to find, as would a less expensive one. Key West was half empty, down on its luck, on the verge of bankruptcy. Ideal base of operations for a writer. Many of you have been to the Key West house. That house was purchased in the 30s for $8,000. Not a bad investment. Between 30 and 36, he was in and out of Key West, creating a different writer from the writer of the 20s. In case you hadn't noticed, Hemingway's writing changes dramatically in the 30s, on purpose, choosing not to repeat himself. While proletarian writers, their names now largely forgotten, were writing about textile mill strikes, Hemingway gave us Death in the Afternoon, a natural history of the Spanish bullfight, as well as a statement about the responsibilities and life of the artist. When Key West allowed the federal government to take over the management of that devastated fishing port, it went bankrupt about 1934. Hemingway published Green Hills of Africa, a safari book, and a book of aesthetics, a writer's book. Going against the grain of the leftist literary 30s, Hemingway was ever his own man, never another face in the crowd. His novels were being translated into French and German. A movie of A Farewell to Arms came out starring Gary Cooper. Hemingway's writing was being regularly imitated and parodied in prominent places. Death in the Rumble Seat appeared in the New Yorker with the statement, with the usual apologies to Ernest Hemingway, who must be pretty sick of this sort of thing. While Depression-era movies gave us escapist films where the gentlemen wore tuxedos, have you noticed on late-night television, anytime it's in black and white film and the guys are in tuxedos, it's from the 1930s, in the middle of the Depression. I've never quite understood that, but while that was happening, Hemingway was writing a series of personal essays called Letters for the newly founded men's magazine Esquire. Subject matter was always himself in Africa, on the Gulf Stream, in Paris, Spain, Cuba, Key West, wherever his interests took him and took us with him. Informal essays, which were frequently interlarded with informal photographs of Hemingway, the author in action, at sea, on the Serengeti, brawny, bearded in a clean-shaven America, bare-chested. He was who he was, and America loved him for it. Single-handedly, he became a spectator sport for increasingly sedentary Americans. When he boated a huge black marlin, the photograph was in Time magazine. When he returned from safari, the New York Times was at the dockside waiting for him. Wherever he went, whatever he did, fish, hunt, brawl, travel, marry, or write, the media was close at hand. His Esquire voice was personal, frequently humorous, combative, prophetic. In September of '35, he warned his audience about the next war. He said it would begin within 2 years. 2 years later, he was in Madrid reporting on the Spanish Civil War. In that October, he was on the cover of Time magazine, and his last experimental work from the 1930s, To Have and Have Not, was published. Without a public relations team, without a literary agent, Hemingway in the 1930s had gained the public recognition usually reserved for movie stars and national politicians. His 30s ended with a play on Broadway, The Fifth Column, and his incredible bestseller, For Whom the Bell Tolls. 500,000 copies sold. Back when 500,000 copies was a big sale. I mean, I guess Stephen King wouldn't think so, but Life magazine documented the novel with pictures from the Spanish Civil War. When he met with Ingrid Bergman to discuss possibly being in the movie, Life magazine again was there. Over the next 10 years, Hemingway published no fiction at all, yet Saturday Review of Literature in 1944 polled its readers. Hemingway was the leading American novelist by 2-1. His name was being dropped regularly in syndicated columns of Edmund Wilson, Leonard Lyons. Between June and December of 44, Hemingway covered the European war with manic energy, deliberately putting himself into dangerous situations. D-Day, June 6, 1944. Most correspondents observed D-Day from the correspondent's ship, which was offshore, safe, out of range, and watching it through glasses. Hemingway went aboard a landing craft to get a closer view. His head was still ringing from a severe concussion as he rode the LCI into the Fox Green sector of Omaha Beach. If you've seen Saving Private Ryan, you have seen the movie version of Fox Green sector. That's what he was filming. 1,000 men died on Omaha Beach that day. The landing craft that Hemingway was riding in took machine gun fire, avoided mines, put its infantrymen ashore, returned to the mothership safely. That bloody morning, 10 other such craft were blown out of the water. Hemingway's luck held, as he said, and he described it in Voyage to Victory, part of what he had seen. I saw a ragged shell hole through the steel plates forward of her pilot house where an 88mm German shell had punched through. Blood was dripping from the shiny edges of the hole into the sea with each roll of the LCI. Her rails and hull had been befouled by seasick men, and her dead were laid forward of her pilot house. At the end of that month, he twice flew missions with the RAF, intercepting German V-1 rockets coming into England. And this is the pilot's memory of one of those evenings, and I'm quoting, Ernest seemed to love the fireworks bursting all around us and urged me to press on. I was acting against my better judgment. If you did blow one up, particularly at night, it was touch and go for yourself. This is a British pilot. I'm not going to do British, but touch and go. We dived even more steeply on the second V-1, gave it 2 long bursts. I pulled away in a confusion of searchlights and intensive flak. As we winged over, there was a huge flash behind us, and the airplane danced around like a leaf in a whirlwind. Ernest seemed to have loved every minute of it. In July, he was back in France on the ground, attaching himself to the 22nd Division, where his own activities became news. And I'm reading you little headlines out of the New York Times. Hemingway is injured. Hemingway captures 6. A close Hemingway call. Hemingway's son captured. Hemingway still at the front. Hemingway's son is liberated. I don't know of any other journalists in World War II that got headlines like that. Under the guise of journalist, he became involved with David Bruce, whom he had known in Cuba at the embassy, and got involved with the OSS. As a matter of fact, Hemingway actually applied for a job with the OSS to use his journalist's credentials as cover. The OSS decided this was back in May of 44, that they probably couldn't use him because they weren't sure how he would behave under orders, which was probably just as well. But with David Bruce and the OSS and working with French resistance, he organized the defense at Rambouillet, gathered intelligence for the push into Paris, and on August the 25th, the feast day of Saint Louis, Hemingway was leading a small group of French and irregulars and irregular GIs into the liberation of Paris and eventually to the Ritz Hotel. He was in and out of Paris that fall, alternating between the battlefields and the Ritz. When he wasn't sick with colds and sore throats or suffering from recurring headaches from an aggravated concussion, Hemingway was by turns brave, gentle, obsessive, foolhardy, loving, brutal, a man surfing along the edge of his manic drive. That fall, with the German army retreating behind the Siegfried Line, Hemingway spent 3 days in Hurtgenwald with the 22nd Infantry. Of the men who went into Hurtgenwald with the 22nd, 85% were killed, wounded, missing in action. tremendous losses there. Hemingway was in the middle of it, an active participant in it, taking the same risks, and came out of it unscratched somehow. Later he said, "I was reborn at Hertgenwald." Between 45 and 61, whatever private life he had was long gone. He was constantly being sought out by reporters, columnists, war buddies, baseball players, and a new breed of academics who were teaching and publishing his fiction, and also by college sophomores. 4 Princeton sophomores showed up at his front door uninvited. Rather than turn them away, he invited them in, mixed martinis, and talked to them for a couple of hours, and then wrote a letter to Carlos Baker saying, "Stop sending your students over here." When his 4th wife, Mary, suffered an almost fatal tubular pregnancy in a rather remote Casper, Wyoming, the story was in the New York Times the next morning. Her fallopian tube burst. She was hemorrhaging to death. Casper's not a big town. The surgeon was off fishing. He didn't get back until that evening. They'd almost run out of blood for plasma to transfuse. On the operating table, Mary's veins collapsed, her pulse stopped. The surgeon told Ernest, "Kiss her goodbye, tell her goodbye, because I can't operate. If I operate now, the shock's going to kill her." Ernest turned to the intern and said, Ernest had seen enough battlefield wounds and blood plasma to know what was happening. He's in the operating room. "Cut for the vein," he said. Cut for the vein, found it, got the needle in, the blood wouldn't flow, the plasma wouldn't flow. He started milking the plasma line, got the plasma flowing into her. She fluttered back to life. They performed the operation, and quite literally, he saved her life. He may have been a son of a bitch, but I'll tell you, in an emergency, you would like to have Ernest Hemingway right there beside you. When he hunted ducks or went on vacation, Time magazine reported it. January 49, millions of Life magazine readers read Malcolm Cowley's Portrait of Mr. Papa with all the pictures. Between 1941 and 61, Life magazine published 16 feature stories on Hemingway, more than any literary agent could possibly have arranged. By this time, Hemingway was larger than life, legendary. His exploits, real and otherwise, were widely known, and it was hard to tell which were true and which were not. 1950, Lillian Ross's profile in The New Yorker, Famous or Infamous, was published. E.B. White did a parody, Across the Street and Into the Grill. And in the 50s, the biographers were at the front door, and Hemingway was fending them off like a good general, giving up ground slowly and protecting his flanks. Critics announced with the publication of Across the River and Into the Trees that Hemingway was over. This was the end of Hemingway as a writer of fiction and as an important figure in American literature. 2 years later, he wrote The Old Man and the Sea, and there was a lot of crow being eaten around the U.S. The Old Man and the Sea was published in Life magazine. 5 million copies of Life magazine sold out in 1 week. His work was being translated into all the major languages of the world. In '54, the 2 plane crashes in Africa produced headlines, Hemingway's dead, obituaries appeared, friends and enemies began giving quotes to newspapermen that they wished afterward they hadn't given in some cases. And of course, then they found him alive, and then the plane crashed again, and there was the concussion. And Hemingway coming out at Antibes, trying to say, you know, my luck, she still holds. It's okay. I'm not really hurt. He was badly hurt. He was concussed. He had head injuries. He had back injuries. But the reporters said he came out of the jungle carrying a bunch of bananas and a bottle of gin. Ogden Nash wrote a song called Hemingways, and it starts out with a bunch of bananas and a bottle of gin. Not well remembered Ogden Nash, but there you have it. He fulfilled, later that year, '54, he was canonized with the Nobel Prize. Time and again during the post-war period, his books and stories were turned into Hollywood films, some of them not so memorable. You remember To Have and Have Not. You know how to whistle, don't you? Just pucker up and blow, that famous Hemingway line. I've often suspected, William Faulkner worked on that film script, and I often wondered, if it was sabotage. But then, hey, my paranoia knows no limits. By the time of his suicide, it was a 2-week running story in most major newspapers of the world. But by that time, we had used him up. From the grave, however, he has published 5 books, and this year, 38 years after his death, we finally have True at First Light. A quick count of my bookshelf before I left Santa Fe, I counted 18 full or partial biographies of Hemingway, either the man or the writer or both. His houses are preserved here in Oak Park. Now the Pfeiffer House in Piggott, Arkansas is preserved. It's going to be a Hemingway writing center. Key West, Ketchum, Cuba. Each summer at San Fermin, thousands of admirers drink themselves silly in Pamplona and follow Camino Hemingway to the bull ring. To achieve and maintain this level of public recognition is more rare than winning the Nobel Prize, more elusive than great fortune, and perfectly in keeping with Hemingway's mantra, which I won't give you in French, but translates roughly, first, one must endure. This year of his centennial, there will be pilgrimages here to Oak Park, other Hemingway sites, the faithful armed with guidebooks, Hemingway's Paris, Hemingway's Key West, Hemingway's Oak Park. There will be more stories, more television documentaries, celebrations, deprecations. Jonathan Yardley, I'm sure, will have something good to tell us. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. You could cut that when you edit this thing. All of which, get me in trouble, all of which will reinforce his name and face as an American icon. To become an icon is a mixed blessing, for the ravenous public quickly sucks the real man dry. No matter how resilient he seemed in the media, Hemingway aged quickly, and the image that he in part created was a difficult one to face with failing health. Yet his life story was Horatio Alger writ large, unknown young man with a high school education who made himself into one of the most admired and imitated writers of his century, one of the most recognized men of his century. He became whom he wanted to be, and we, the American public, made him into an icon, a representative of a writing style or a lifestyle that we admired, envied, desired, detested, and knew we would never have. He was the designated hitter for his generation. He took the risks we could not afford, played the game for which we lacked the skills, sustained the hurts that we avoided, and wrote the stories that moved us. Despite wars, injuries, mental and physical illness, and his strenuous life, Hemingway left permanently embedded in our literary history several of the finest short stories written in this century or any other time. At least 3, possibly 4 major novels, and a writer's life carried out on an epic scale. We read his works in the same way a surveyor reads geodetic benchmarks. It doesn't matter whether you like the elevation or not, or admire the view, at least you know exactly where you are. His clean, well-lighted style has at some point influenced most American writers of this century. That he self-destructed affirmed his humanity. That he wrote as well as he did promises his permanence. Whether one admires Hemingway or not, he is an authentic artifact, a piece of the continent, an American author whose career changed the face of our fiction. Those who know little of his life and less of his writing call him macho, a word he never used. Those more knowledgeable appreciate the complexity of the man whose message was simple and true. We are doomed to lose, so we must lose on our own terms. That is all that is left us, we exiles from the Garden of Eden. Thank you.
Michael Reynolds was the Associate Dean and Professor at North Carolina University. He now lives and works in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Mr. Reynolds is the author of a 5-book series tracing the life of Ernest Hemingway. This is the last in that series. Hemingway, The Final Years, was published this month by W. Norton and Company. The book is reviewed in last Thursday's New York Times. Centennial programs with biographer Michael Reynolds. This book, Hemingway, The Final Years, was published this month. It's Mr. Reynolds' 5th and final book in a series looking at the life of American writer Ernest Hemingway. Mr. Reynolds talked about Mr. Hemingway and his book recently in Oak Park, Illinois, where Mr. Hemingway spent part of his childhood. The event takes place in the high school Hemingway attended as a boy.
This brings us to the official business of our first session this morning. And it is a great pleasure to introduce Mike Reynolds. Had a chance to work as closely with Mike as I've ever worked on the panel yesterday that I referred to, and watched him handle the kinds of silliness and the kinds of
Something about our own collective psychic needs because we remember them. To achieve widespread recognition in one's own time, of course, is crucial to becoming an American icon. But the status does not come automatically. Just because you're important while you're alive isn't enough. To reach that higher level of recognition, one must endure in the nation's consciousness. Abe Lincoln became such an icon. Honest Abe, the uncommon, common man. We put his face on the copper penny where the poorest of the poor can see it every day. We put his general, Ulysses S. Grant, on the $50 bill. I doubt if you put Ulysses S. Grant's picture on the front of Life magazine today that anybody would recognize him, although $50.
well intended, I think, often, but misleading comments we hear about Hemingway in a manner that was truly noble and intelligent, reflecting the 27 years he's put into Hemingway scholarship in doing 5 volumes of Hemingway biography, several other books on Hemingway, a threat to do more, revision on Hemingway in the future. Mike is Professor Emeritus from North Carolina State. He's the newly elected president of the Hemingway Society. He's agreed to squeeze us into a several-week series of engagements dealing with the centennial. He's done the website New York Times introduction to Hemingway. I encourage you to read. Very nice overview. And has been a longtime friend of the foundation. He was our invited speaker in the early 90s for the birthday. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mike Reynolds.
Good place to be at this time of year, this time of the century. I see a lot of old friends out there. I'm particularly honored. I see H.R. Stonebuck back there, who's never gotten up for anything this early at a conference. It is my pleasure to speak, to lecture the choir, as it were, on Hemingway as an American icon. This is not my first trip to Oak Park, as you might imagine. I've been coming here since the 70s, off and on, but this is kind of a culmination. American iconography is an amazing collection of disparate events and people from our collective past. Washington crossing the Delaware, MacArthur coming ashore in the Philippines, names, faces that we admire, respect, detest, fear. Most importantly, names and faces we recognize. Ben Franklin, self-made man. Babe Ruth watching the ball go over the fence. Joe McCarthy, demagogue. Marines raising the flag at Iwo Jima. They're images that are remembered and tell us